Hello. With the sound of a Bretonnian lance formation thundering towards us, and the old world all set to return, I thought now would be the perfect time to take a look at the history of Warhammer Fantasy's faction of noble knights and put-upon peasants. Have they always been as important to Warhammer lore, and have they changed over time? I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're building Warhammer armies with the Bretonnians. Warhammer the Old World has launched with the Bretonnians at the forefront of the game. They are getting an entire boxed release dedicated only to them. But they've not always been quite so centre stage, playing a background role in many versions of Warhammer Fantasy history. We are going to explore, relatively briefly, that development history through all 8 editions of Warhammer Fantasy. It's not going to be exhaustive, but we are going to take a look at some of the key moments in Bretonnians' development history. Before we do that though, why don't you give this video a like? That will let me know if you want to see more of this kind of thing. And where better to begin than before the beginning. In the years before Warhammer Fantasy was first created, Citadel Miniatures produced a range of different miniature models. Many of them were historicals, and included medieval and dark age ranges. And they also made a lot of minis for use with role-playing games. The biggest of all, of course, being D&D. All of the character classes were covered, and there was a nice range of paladins that look just like classic Bretonnia knights in heavy armour. In 1983, the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy was released, and part of the design brief that was laid down by Citadel co-founder and manager Brian Ansell was that players should be able to use all of their pre-existing Citadel minis. The game was subtitled the Mass Combat Fantasy Role-Playing Game, and in service of that mass combat ideal, players were encouraged to use as many miniatures as they wanted, or indeed could, at a time. There was no formal setting for the game, so you could pitch your D&D monsters against your historical samurai, and it was all good. Citadel's C01 series included a range of fighters that were perfect for using both as heroes in a D&D campaign and leading the charge on a Warhammer battlefield. And then in the first supplement for the game, Forces of Fantasy, there were the beginnings of a coherent fantasy setting. The race of men in this nascent Warhammer world were described as belonging to 4 distinct groups: the men of the East, the men of the North, the men of the Orient, and the men of the West, the latter of which were said to come from the Old World. The north of the Old World is technically and socially primitive, 11th to 13th century Europe, whilst the central areas are slightly more sophisticated, 13th to 15th century Europe, and the south is most advanced, 15th to 16th century Europe. Gunpowder weapons are totally unknown in the north, but are widely accepted in the south, although even here they are crude and far from common. So the idea that Warhammer's Old World was inspired by and based on Europe from history was already present in the first edition, and perhaps that should be no surprise given that Rick Priestley studied archaeology. But the exact time period was somewhat in flux, especially based on the geography of the continent. But this was a time before there was a rigid idea of the lore, if in fact that has ever really existed. So players were expected to inform and interpret the setting that they were going to play in themselves. Though the text does continue on to say, although now somewhat old-fashioned, the practice of introducing the nobility to the sport of combat is still widespread. Most of these so-called knights have better than average martial abilities due to years of training. So even though that first edition had a setting that was quite fluid and demanded a lot from its players, there was already the idea that there were well-trained, somewhat noble knights floating around in this world. And with the second edition, Warhammer's soon-to-be-called known world would actually start to detail a lot more about the peoples and places that exist within it, including, eventually, the Bretonnians. There was now a map of the Warhammer setting and further explanation that the Old World corresponds to Europe during the Middle Ages, consisting of a number of human-dominated, small independent states that share a common cultural heritage and language. In 1984, a regiment of renown appeared with all the trappings of Knights Templar and Holy Crusaders questing with a religious zeal, the Knights of Origio. These were not Bretonnians, with a background drawn more clearly from real crusading history, but they bear some of the stylistic elements that would recur in later Bretonnian knights over the years, even if this particular regiment seemed as far removed from chivalry as you could get. In 1987's Ravening Horde supplement, the forces of men in the Warhammer world were more clearly defined, with the Empire, Nippon, and the Norse all getting their own army lists. But there was still no official Bretonnian army just yet. That didn't mean that Bretonnia doesn't exist in the world at this point though. In the Terror of the Lichmaster campaign, Heinrich Kemmler returns from the Black Mountains to wreak havoc on a small village called Frugelhofen, near to the Bretonnian territory of Connell, and in its sequel, Bretonnian monks of Thal become the target of the Lichmaster. White Dwarf issue 82 included an advert for the expanding range of feudal historical miniatures sculpted by Michael and Alan Perry. The ad suggested that the figures are ideal for use in armies of the Old World, especially the northern and western areas such as the Empire and Bretonnia. I'm not exactly sure when the name Bretonnia first appeared in Warhammer lore, presumably inspired by Brittany and the Bretons of northwest France, but it is interesting to note that it's spelt with 2 T's in this appearance, which would not always be the case. By 1986, the Warhammer world had become far more formalised, due in no small part to the incredible writing from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Along with the Old World map by Jez Goodwin, the first edition of WFRP featured extensive information on the geography and culture of the Bretonnian Kingdom, more firmly establishing it as a place populated by well-trained knights, existing in a strict hierarchy of nobility. There's no mention of the Lady of the Lake or the Fey Enchantress or all of that Arthurian flavour that would so come to define Bretonnia for so many players. But many of the places are present and correct. The damned city of Mousillon, the nourishing river Morceau, and the most populous city in the kingdom, Gisero. Though Gisero is described not as a shining city of chivalry, but instead thusly. In spite of its illustrious history and special place amongst the annals of Bretonnia, the filth and decadence of all Bretonnian cities is especially manifest here. Thieves and agitators are the least dangerous of the creatures that roam the countless miles of disused tunnels and drains beneath the city streets. And to be honest, the people of Bretonnia don't sound that much nicer. Perhaps the flippant attitude of Bretonnia's elite to the terrors that surround them may be explained by the relative calm and prosperity of their lands. It is more likely that this is itself a sign of the chaos that has distorted the very soul of the Bretonnian people. The ruling classes of this land are ridden with corruption, willfully blind to the decay around them, and sordidly decadent in every way. The following year, Warhammer Fantasy Battles 3rd edition arrived, and with it, the decadent and decaying definition of Bretonnia was further established. The once proud cities and prosperous ports have fallen into ruin. A national apathy has set in that has given rise to widespread corruption, inefficiency, and decay. The aristocracy looks to its own pleasures, whilst the unruly mob starves amidst the worst squalor in the old world. Under their king Charles III, the once great nation of Bretonnia had really let themselves go. Oh, and the bestiary also features giant snails, which apparently only the Bretonnians hunt and eat. As with the earlier editions of the game, if you wanted to theme your army around Bretonnia instead of any of the other nations of the old world, then you could just grab some soldier minis, and there you went. It was entirely up to you. But things were about to get far more serious, with army lists. Warhammer Armies was the 3rd edition equivalent to the Ravening Hordes book. It provided full army lists for a range of factions, including for the first time, the Bretonnians. The description and details for the army would heighten the conflict inherent in Bretonnian lore up to this point. The Bretonnians are at once the most noble of knights, virtuous and dedicated to chivalry, but at the same time, they feature units of ill-equipped, untrained peasants who are forced into battle with names like villains, a word which seems to be traceable back to the mid-16th century Low German word for peasant, rascals, which in Middle English meant a mob, and brigands, which in late Middle English could denote an irregular foot soldier. I'm not going to lie, at first I thought that those names were just Rick Priestley and Nigel Stillman having a load of fun, but they are perfect in so many ways. Though there is no explanation for why one of the units is called Ribalds, unless the men in it are just a really rude bunch of lads. We do see what would become a stalwart of the Bretonnian army, the Reliquary, with the Bretonnian war altar. But there were still traces of the faction's considerable overlap with the Empire, given that they could field cannon as well, known as l'ordonnance. The range of Bretonnian models produced for the 3rd edition would lean heavily on the Perry twins' expertise in historical miniature sculpting, many of which can actually still be bought from the Wargames Foundry, which I think is really cool. These miniatures would be regularly showcased in White Dwarf, and there were new rules and painting guides as well. And I think it is worth double noting that there is a really vast array of Bretonnian war machinery available during this period. Even a pot de feu, or pot of fire, not to be confused with pot au feu, which is a beef stew and probably only useful to halflings when at war. In White Dwarf 137, there was also a further Bretonnian army list designed to complement the one from Warhammer Armies, introducing the Peasant Levy. During this edition, there would also be frequent mention of Bretonnia in the background to characters featured in the GW Books range. The vampire Genevieve was born in the Bretonnian city of Paravon before it was sacked by the great enchanter Drachenfels. The minstrel Orfeo hails from the kingdom of Bretonnia, and there are several short stories in the various anthologies that touch on or visit Bretonnian places. In an interview with the Awesome Lies blog, former GW writer and editor Paul Coburn mentioned that around this time, a treatment was prepared for a potential Wolfrup supplement based entirely on Bretonnia, though of course that sadly never came to pass. As the era of Warhammer Fantasy Battle 3rd edition drew to a close, there would be a slightly unusual final outing for the Knights of Bretonnia, featuring in a battle report using a rule system and edition of the game that they would barely feature in. White Dwarf 153 previewed the new edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and it featured a battle report fought using these new rules systems. Curiously enough, the Battle of Grimdal's Tomb pitched Bill King's Dwarves against Nigel Stillman's Bretonnians, and though Bretonnia and its people would feature in the new edition, they would be far from at the centre of the action. Instead, they would mostly be set dressing and background actors. The Bretonnians were only minor players in the lore of the 4th edition, but they did feature in the evolving stories for many of the other factions. In the 4th edition core box, the Battle Bestiary provided an overview of the known world, and a description of all of the major races, including the men of Bretonnia. As in 3rd edition, they were painted as a strictly feudal society, with highly trained noble knights and a poorly trained peasantry. But the language that describes the typical Bretonnian peasant is no longer quite so adamant that they lived the most wretched lives in the old world. Things are a little more kid-friendly in this edition, and the knights are given an even stronger commitment to their life of chivalry. All Bretonnian knights are raised from childhood to practice the noble code of chivalry, which demands not only the highest standards of honour, combat skills, and horsemanship, but also states that knights protect the weak, honour their feudal lords, and destroy the enemies of Bretonnia. So the Bretonnians do feature in the Battle Bestiary of the core box, but without a Warhammer Armies book of their own, they are relegated to just appearing in the backstory for the other factions. The Wood Elves, for example, have a close and lasting relationship with the Bretonnians, having agreed an eternal alliance with the surprisingly cautious King Louis the Rash. In the Skaven Armies book, there is much talk of the Red Pox spread through Bretonnia by Clan Pestilence, given the proximity of Skaven Blight to the Bretonnian realm. And in Warhammer Armies Undead, there was of course the damnable tale of Mousillon and its persistent necromancer problems. And you could also find Bretonnian fleets in the seas of the known world, as they were featured in the tremendous classic Man o' War. Bretonnia's galleons were fast and beautiful ships crewed by some of the finest sailors in the old world. Let's be honest though, the popular conception of Bretonnians did not really take root until 5th edition. Over the course of the 4th edition Armies books, various stories, and many White Dwarf articles, the nature of Bretonnia had changed to make it more noble and less exploitative of the poorest members of its society. The nobles were still considered fops, but they were less the decadent aristocrats of pre-revolutionary France and more the over-the-top and pompous dandies that their down-to-earth empire counterparts could easily take the mickey out of. And it was the 5th edition Warhammer Armies book that would deliver the pinnacle of this reformed view of Bretonnia. Inspired by Arthurian legend and clearly searching for a way to further distinguish the armies of Bretonnia from those of the Empire, designer Nigel Stillman fully leaned into the idea of chivalrous knights, poetic and tragic quests, and the last decent kingdom in the old world. This new Bretonnia was deeply devoted to the Lady of the Lake, a deity who granted favours and blessings to the most noble of her followers, and they were also fully committed to the code of chivalry, following its 7 commandments under any circumstance. To serve the Lady of the Lake, to defend the domain entrusted to him, to protect the weak and fight for the right, always to fight the enemies of virtue and order, never to give up the fight until the foes are defeated, never to break faith with a friend and ally, always to display honour and courtesy. Or I guess you could say, never give up, never surrender. In this meritocratic society, a peasant could rise to be a knight. Meanwhile, the rougher edges of the downtrodden masses were polished off as the game became somewhat more accessible for a wider audience. Knights and their virtues became the core focus of the army list, with special formations and mighty warhorses. Infantry units were still commoners, but with less playful names. Now they were just squires, men-at-arms, and bowmen, and all gunpowder weaponry was long gone. The 5th edition core box, of course, had featured Bretonnian cover art, along with some lizardmen, and came packed with plastic knights and bowmen. And I couldn't not take a moment to just marvel once again at Michael Perry's timeless Green Knight. There was at least one new way to play a Bretonnian during this edition, though, and that was in Warhammer Quest. The Bretonnian Knight was an adventurer who was on a long quest to recover a lost Bretonnian relic, another classic miniature designed by Gary Morley. There were lots of Bretonnians riding around in 5th edition and its supplements, including 2 campaign packs, but things would take a darker turn with the advent of the 6th edition. In the 6th edition of Warhammer, the Bretonnian Knight lost some of their luster, with much of the grim darkness present in earlier iterations of Bretonnian lore restored. The peasants of Bretonnia live hand to mouth, toiling in the fields day in, day out, in absolute destitute poverty. Most will not survive to see middle age, and theirs is a thankless role. Yet, without their produce and taxes, the knights could ill afford to live in the manner to which they are accustomed. Bretonnia was still a kingdom full of valorous knights and virtues, but it once again demonstrated how one strata of society could place an abstract view of honour above the welfare of their own people, though there is less of the influence of chaos that was seen in earlier editions, so you win some. There are, of course, still plenty of colourful heraldic knights, and a powerful noble king with the heart of a lion. Finally, the mighty trebuchet arrived to replace all of those cannon. Bretonnia had war machines once again, and we even got the return of a sort of classic name for one of the infantry units, vilain, which of course is a medieval term for a feudal tenant. Yep, I had to Google that one as well. And that was where Bretonnians remained. Of course, there were other new releases and expansions to the range, but there was no new army book during the 7th or 8th editions of Warhammer Fantasy. They played their part in the end times, of course, and you could field them in Warmaster via a mail-order only release. There were even town crier rules for a Bretonnian warband in Mordheim, but it's only now that they finally returned to the battlefield fully formed, after almost a decade away, and they do so in an era of prosperity and societal bliss, from the looks of things, taking more of a page out of the 5th edition Armies book than the 6th edition one. Whether that's going to turn out to be a good thing for the lore or not, who knows? I think it's going to be super exciting to see how things develop. And I, for one, am very excited to see Bretonnians charging forward once again. I hope that you've enjoyed this quick ride through the history of the Bretonnian army in Warhammer. If I missed anything major, please let me know down below. And please leave a comment to let me know which faction in Warhammer Fantasy or 40k you would love to see me tackle next in this series. If you want to support my work here on the channel, you can do so by checking out my Patreon or my Ko-fi, or just joining my Discord. And I've put links to all of those in the description below. Thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Okay, so it says carrots, leeks, onions, and turnips. And you're supposed to use beef, but I wonder if we could get away with using corn. Pot de corn. Pot de feuille. Pot de corn feuille. It will really piss off the Bretonnians.